Good morning to all our attendees. We're going to let a few more folks get logged in here, and then we'll turn it over to the Congresswoman. One moment. Okay, good morning to all. Thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Congresswoman McCollum for introductory remarks.
Thank you and good morning. I especially want to thank you for joining us on this law enforcement leader conversation today on Gun Violence Awareness Day, and in fact, Gun Violence Awareness Month. Sadly, recent events have made us all too aware of the epidemic of gun violence, mass killings, and their devastating families. They're ripping apart communities and forcing all of us at times to question our own safety. During the coming weeks, I'll be talking with gun safety advocates, elected leaders, and others about this preventable crisis. But today, I'm starting with the people you see on this Zoom. Why? Because they are the first to respond when gun violence occurs in our communities. The common denominator is guns are easy to access, and individuals are using these guns to commit acts of violence. Over the years, I voted in the U.S. House of Representatives time and time again to ban assault weapons, to ensure universal background checks to block access to firearms to those who shouldn't have them. But common gun safety provisions are obstructed every step of the way by the gun lobby and their allies in Congress. In fact, states like Texas are making it easy to obtain and carry firearms, even assault weapons, in public without a permit or even training. In Congress, my voice, my vote, my values are all focused on common sense measures that reduce gun violence, keep guns off of our streets, and eliminate access to guns that are designed for mass murder. The safety of our families and our communities is my priority. We are all heartbroken and outraged at the mass murder of elementary school children and the teachers and the students in Texas, only days after the Buffalo, New York massacre, which deliberately targeted Black Americans in a neighborhood grocery store. And this week, another atrocity, this time in a healthcare clinic. At the wake of this tragedy, and every tragedy, every member of Congress needs to be held accountable for their actions on effective gun safety laws. More than a year ago, House Democrats, we acted by passing two major pieces of gun violence prevention. I co-sponsored and voted for both of these bills that make our families and our communities more secure. One was the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, and it made background checks on every gun, sale, or transfer. And of course, we had common sense measures in there, gifts to family members or transfers for hunting rifles, target shooting as self-defense. But there still was background checks for these weapons that are being used in our community right now, today, to murder people. Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021 strengthened background procedures by providing the FBI additional time to do background checks. We believe that that would have prevented what happened in Charleston. That's why it's often referred to as a Charleston loophole. But when it went over to the Senate Republicans continued to block action on even what I believe are these very, very basic common sense life-saving measures. Their obstruction, in my opinion, is causing more preventable gun deaths. More and more, we're seeing the dangerous ideology of hate, including white supremacist beliefs, and that is motivating and inspiring mass shooters to target communities of color. And that was clearly evident in what just happened in Buffalo, New York. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022. And we did that to combat the growing threat of domestic violence, extremist groups and individuals, including racial and ethnically motivated violent extremists like white supremacists. Now, I'll continue to urge the Senate on action on the legislation we've passed, but in the House, we know even with what we passed, there's more work to do. I'm proud to be a member of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, and I'm working to advocate gun safety measures. I'm the original co-sponsor of the assault weapons ban prohibiting the sale, transfer, manufacturing, and import of semi-automatic weapons and ammunition feeding devices over 10 rounds, and to allow the use of burn grants for gun buybacks. I've also signed a letter to President Biden seeking an executive order on the importation of assault weapons. Now, my role in Congress is as an appropriator. And so I'm proud to help lead to make sure that we have more money, billions of dollars available for burn grants and other resources to support safer communities and the funding law for fiscal 2022. And you have my support to those in law enforcement to increase burn grants. And I hope we have that as part of our discussion. But before we turn to you, I just want to make sure folks know that what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. when I return next week. The House will be voting on Protecting Our Children Act. This package will include raising the minimum purchase age for semi-automatic weapons from 18 to 21, outlawing the purchasing age for semi-automatic weapons from 18 to 21. In Minnesota, we have some provisions on that, but other states have nothing. And then we know these guns cross state lines all the time. Outlawing high capacity magazines and bump stocks for civilian use. They only make mass shootings happen quicker, faster, and they become more deadly. Subjecting ghost guns purchases to background checks and requirements. Cracking down on gun safety trafficking and straw purchasing, and strengthening the safe storage requirements like gun locks to protect children from accidental shootings. In my opinion, there's no excuse for gun violence being the number one killer of children and teenagers in this country. So I'm hoping the Senate will will join us in protecting children. So also next week, we're going to take another vote on the Federal Extremism Risk Protection Order Act. And this legislation will keep guns out of the hands of those who threaten themselves or others nationwide. And it's going to encourage states to enact their own laws. Minnesota has enacted many of those. So we've got other bills coming to the floor about the active shooter alert. It's an AMBER style alert notifying when a mass shooting is occurring or has occurred. And it's widely supported by law enforcement. So we thank law enforcement for their input on these bills. And then we're also going to move once again in the House on an assault weapons ban. So before I turn it over to folks, I just want to really say why I believe we need to have these discussions as a community. And I'm so glad so many of you are listening and to hear from our first responders. We must put the lives of school children, shoppers, churchgoers, hospital patients, staffs, our neighbors at movie theaters or concerts ahead of the gun lobby and gun makers' profits. And that's why I want to hear from the first responders today. When the unthinkable happens, the men and women in your departments are the first to respond, whether it's a suicide, an accidental discharge of firearms that result in a death or weapons crime. Sadly, this is at the top of my mind in April when Roseville officer Ryan Dubray was shot and seriously injured while responding on a police call. I look forward to hearing from all of you. I would wish you to be direct and frank about what your first responders are experiencing on our streets and in our neighborhoods. But before we get into that discussion, I would like each of you to take a minute to introduce yourselves because we have a wide representative of our communities here, and others just couldn't join us today, unfortunately, but we are in constant contact with them. So I don't know how the screen looks to you, so I'm just going to call on somebody, hope that it's going left from right, and call on the Chief of Roseville.
Good morning. I'm Erica Scheider, as you mentioned, the chief at the Roseville Police Department. I've been with the department for 25 years and took over as chief in 2020. And thank you for having us here today in this really important topic.
Jeremy Ellison, acting chief. Did I get that right for St. Paul?
Yes, Congresswoman, interim chief. So good morning, everybody. My name is Jeremy Elliston. I'm currently serving as the interim chief of police for St. Paul. I've been with the department for 22 years and have served in a variety of assignments throughout that time. I really want to thank you, Congresswoman McCollum, for the opportunity to be here today with this group of law enforcement leaders. This is a extremely important topic and something that we're discussing every single day here in St. Paul. So thank you.
Well, Chief Pasnick, I'm worried that I said your last name wrong, so I was just going to call you Chief Tony. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. My name, or good afternoon, whatever time zone you're in there. But Tony Patesnick, Director of Public Safety for the City of New Brighton. I've been here for about 25 years, served as the chief for the past 6. Thanks for this opportunity to join my colleagues and talk about a very important issue for all of our communities.
Thank you. Chief Miller?
Morning, everyone. Thank you. Yes, Congresswoman, thank you for inviting us and allowing me to sit alongside people. I think I'm the token small agency representative. I've been in law enforcement for 24 years, recently serving as the Chief Deputy in the Washington County Sheriff's Office. And I've only been with Stillwater Police Department for just over a year, but definitely have the same concerns as my colleagues do on this call. So thank you for having me.
And joining us from the federal law enforcement, McCary.
Hello, I'm Special Agent in Charge Will McCrary for the St. Paul Field Division of ATF. That's the western side of Wisconsin, the state of Minnesota, and the states of North and South Dakota.
And somebody I've known for a long time, the Assistant Commissioner of State Public Safety, Mr. Smith.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman McCollum. It's good to see you again. We usually run into each other passing in the wind at the airport, but you're my Congresswoman as well. You've done a tremendous amount of things for law enforcement throughout. I'm the old guy in the room, 40 years in June that I've been in this business. So thank you. I worked for the St. Paul Police Department along with my volunteer time for 29 years. I did work for the Obama administration on similar issues that we're talking about right here. I've worked at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension as statewide training director. I'm now the Assistant Commissioner for Law Enforcement for the state. I'm a member of the African American Leadership Council, NAACP. I work closely with Black ministers and youth groups. All these things you're talking about here today have touched me and I'm very passionate about. I look forward to our conversation, but I've also lived through, and you brought up what happened in Roseville, 3 St. Paul police officers that were killed by individuals that should not have had weapons. Tim Jones, Ron Ryan, I was there. One of my best friends in life, Jerry Vick, was killed by an individual who should not have had a firearm, and a stolen firearm to boot should not have happened. So thank you. This is an important conversation, and especially to protect our children.
Thank you. Chief Egg.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Just to echo what you've already heard, I'm really happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. I'm the police chief in the city of Woodbury, public safety director. I've been doing that job for 15 years and I've been with the city for 33 years. So Tom, thanks for being the oldest guy in the room and taking the pressure off. That was handy. This is a really important topic for all of us. I don't care if it's small town, big city, suburban area. It affects all of us. And it's nice to see all these faces here kind of united to try to find some solutions, and appreciate your continued passion on this issue, Congresswoman. Thank you.
Well, and I want to thank all of you, having been on a North St. Paul City Council with a very small police force. I learned about mutual aid real quick and real fast. And I am so proud of the East Metro team, the way the mayors, police departments, firefighters, all the first responders, public works, everybody pitches in together to make our community safer. We all have each other's back in the East Metro. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize all the hard work that you do in your own capacity, but all the hard work you do together. And I told Mr. McCray that right away when I met him in my office, how proud I was of the way everybody worked together. I'm going to start this out kind of talking about some of the things that I fund, and I'm going to be going back working on the funding bills besides voting on some of these gun safety measures that I talked about. So one of the tools that we have in the toolbox are burn grants, and there's some other resources. So maybe, and I won't call on anybody, you can just start or you can just raise your hand and then I will call on you. But how have burn grants and other resources from the federal government not only helped maybe in the capacity of working with the state government, Tom, but with local units of government? And then Mr. McCurry, if you want to add anything on about some other federal resources that maybe Congress could enhance to help your work at the times that you're called in to work with local law enforcement?
Well, I can just say very quickly that burn grants are just one of the most critical things for all of our law enforcement partners in the state of Minnesota. They have helped us to do amazing work before. And also what a lot of people don't understand is burn grants can also bring our community partners into doing some of this work with us. It doesn't just give us tools for law enforcement, but it gives us tools to work with the very stakeholders that we're trying to protect. So I will end with that. Without the burn grants, and again, I'm going through from when I was a sergeant, a lieutenant, all the way up to chief of police. At every level, burn grants helped us to reduce violence, also do some outreach work, and it's one of the most critical components nationally for any of the type of work that we do in law enforcement at every single level.
Anybody else want to comment on burn grants? So one of the things that when I was on the city council in North St. Paul and the work I did at the state and now I do here, there's a lot of talk about schools and school safety and police liaisons. And we hear, parents talk about, active school shootings and drills and all that. But behind the scene, if that's going to be a drill or a communication or reliance on how we come to an aid when this type of tragedy is happening, what are some of the things that you think would be helpful for you, either in your capacity of working with schools, working with communities, having training available? I was at Century College when we did an active shooter training. I got to observe that, but those are very expensive to put on. It's, working mutual aid, it's getting first responders and community involved. What are some of the things that are on a lot of parents' mind right now? And I'm not going to comment on what happened with the police department down there. We just saw a great first responder at a medical clinic. So this is not about criticizing anybody, but what are some of the tools that would be helpful for you? Or what are some of the things our schools should have? Because we put legislation in after all these school shootings to try to do things. And are there any things I should be looking at or reaching out to our school districts on, or even large community areas? We have hospitals and other places. We had that terrible shooting down on West 7th. So anything about tools that might be beneficial that I could bring to the table? Go ahead.
Yeah, Congresswoman, I can speak a little bit from, we haven't seen the level of gun violence that some of the other cities have and some of my colleagues on here, but I can tell you as a city that has, hundreds of thousands of people coming to visit every year, a ton of schools and a hospital are really concerned. And so the training aspect is significant for our officers, as well as the equipment. And so we battle every year on whether or not we can get equipment, including ballistic vests, including armor through federal avenues, and every few years that seems to come under scrutiny and whether or not that is going to be allowed. And that is something that is super important because those items are extremely expensive and sometimes outside of the scope of a current municipality's levy. And so having access to some of those items, East Metro, we have a great collaborative out here, and we've been able to access life-saving equipment for our tactical officers and our street officers to be able to respond to these types of events. And then lastly, not to take up all the time, but I would think, as we start talking about gun prevention and access to weapons, as well as mental health issues, threat assessment groups, kind of the third leg of this stool, is really spending time in collaborative groups, having access to mental health data, medical data, and working on, I can tell you in the chief bag and some of the groups that we sit on, we can name 3 or 4 individuals that we have no doubt without the collaborative group, including doctors, social workers, law enforcement, working together to get people the services that they need, might have ended in a tragedy. So these threat assessment groups and really doing that research on the front end is really significant for us.
I'm going to be familiar here and just use first names. So we'll do Erica and then we'll do William. So Erica, I just want to piggyback a little bit on what Brian just said. What just has recently happened now is, even in Buffalo, we had a person who was trained, a good, quote unquote, a good guy with a gun, who was not only outgunned, but when he went to use his, it wouldn't have been as effective as most people would have thought because of the body armor that the perpetrator was wearing. So I just wanted to tag that on and hear your comments on this issue.
Yeah, and I'll kind of piggyback on what Chief Mueller said, that the funding for the training and for the equipment is so important. After our tragic event involving Officer Duxbury, we've identified a number of equipment needs. And so now we're trying to scramble to figure out how to fund those, rifle plates for all of our officers, additional shields, really life-saving equipment that we need to have, but finding ways to fund it is always challenging. We're really fortunate we were able to do active shooter training this past about a week ago, and we're able to use funding through Ramsey County to be able to fund that. So the continued support of that funding is really important, not only for the equipment, but also for the training.
So William, you wanted to add something, and then Tom?
I do. Thank you. And to be clear, ATF takes no political positions on anything. If Congress enacts a law, we faithfully enforce it. I do want to let everybody know that we are bringing in more crime gun intelligence, including a NIBIN van, National Integrated Ballistics Imaging Network van, to St. Paul in the next couple of weeks, so that when you have crime guns that you've recovered at a scene, we can put those casings in, put the trace information from those guns in, and build the networks of where folks are getting their crime guns, and identify the active shooters, the ones who are actually going out, not in so much like a school shooter type, but the ones who are shooting every night or every other night, and disrupt the violence cycle that way. So there is 3 NIBIN machines in the state right now. We're getting another one in our division that I'm actually going to have in my office. So for those of you who have crime guns on the shelf, or that recover crime guns overnight, we'll be able to very, very quickly turn those around and get information back out to you on that. That has been very helpful.
Tom, you had your question, hand up on this, and then I'm going to toss out another question for discussion.
Yep, real briefly, and to SAC McCrary's point at the BCA as well, that traveling NIBIN's truck is important, and they're purchasing 2 machines as well. But I want to talk just for 1 second about the front end. And to Chief Mueller brought something up that resonated with me as a training director at the BCA. We need to highlight, and Congresswoman, if you can help us with this. So the FBI in our local field office, and they have task force officers, Randy McAllister, who works for Cottage Grove, they have threat assessment teams. And I put that training on virtually for the BCA, and we need to push that more. And those threat assessment teams, all they do, the FBI helps to organize people from schools, from hospitals, from mental health services, where they can share information about individuals that have red flags that maybe we would have stopped the Buffalo, Minnesota shooting. All those things came up after the fact. That training is there, but we have to be able to push that out to all law enforcement agencies in Minnesota. There's 434 law enforcement agencies. That includes 87 sheriff's departments. The last thing I'll say about active shooter training or response to incidents like this, the support, whether it's through burn grants or whatever, Congresswoman, if we could do regional training, because there are so many small agencies throughout Minnesota, there's no rhyme or reason where these things happen, just like in Uvalde, a very small town. So if we could do that training, not just Jeremy, Chief Ellison, and I were used to doing this training with St. Paul. We're a big agency. We'd host other metro agency to come and do that training. But what about southern Minnesota and middle and northern Minnesota? They don't have those opportunities. So if we could do regional training, and whether we sponsor it through the state to bring that training so we have all those agencies there, I think that would help us tremendously.
So training and mental illness, sometimes kind of come in together for response. So there's training to when, the shooting's taking place. There's training to work with the community to identify things like that. You know, our schools, and I think a lot of our community organizations, and I'm going to include our first responders, because we have a different mix of way people respond on scene. Sometimes it's police, paramedics, sometimes it's fire. With mental health and all the talk about what we wanted to do with mental health, sometimes I feel like I hear more talk and I don't see the dollars or the resources really out there to help, because you need mental health counselors, which we're short of. You need mental health beds, sometimes what we're short of. We need to have conversations with doctors and families, because, you know, a red flag log's only as good as a family knows how to access it or feels comfortable accessing it, or knows a police department is approachable. Could you maybe talk about some of the challenges that I need to hear from you as we work with community leaders and physicians in that about mental health? Because you've got a big job to do. And I know departments are really focusing on how to reduce conflict when approaching a car or going into a situation. All of that is important, but all that comes with extra training. And I'll go back to North St. Paul. We had 8 officers. Taking somebody off to do training meant we invoked mutual aid, so we had cover. You also have to go to court and other things like that. So this puts a real strain not only on dollars, but at times personal hours when you're doing your shift scheduling. What should we know about how you are really working hard to get the mental health component done, and what the community can do, and what elected leaders like myself can do? Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking right at you on the Zoom making eye contact, except you can't see me making eye
No,
contact.
I see you.
Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So one example would in our city is we've got an embedded social worker now that works right alongside our officers. She's works for the county, works with our city officers, and they're part of a community support team to try to help on the prevention side on the front end of this, getting contact with people before the crisis call happens and sometimes after, and then trying to figure out a safety plan for that family or for that person. It works. We know it's a great model, but there's only so much funding, and for that model to grow and just become a standard in our industry, it's going to take some financial support. And I think it's a great place on a national or federal level to be helping your local police departments to make this thing happen. So that would be one example of something, Congresswoman, that we would love to see some additional financial support and see this type of model grow throughout our communities in the state.
Anybody else want to add to that? Go ahead.
I do. I'm actually out at the Major City Chiefs meeting and the Police Executive Research Forum on the West Coast today. And this was a very big topic of discussion over the last 2 days. One of the things that came out of it was that there are some of the cities that are providing conflict resolution training for people in neighborhoods, so that folks who are in violence-plagued neighborhoods are able to access different ways of responding other than shooting, other than getting together a group of folks for an insult over social media. And that's something that we really haven't explored very much. I just heard about it 2 days ago, and I've been taking notes frantically since. So
Sounds
that might be
good.
something that could be very effective.
Tony, you had your hand up.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention that we've undertaken here in Ramsey County, and so speaking on behalf of my peers as well, but we share a consolidated dispatch center at the Ramsey County Emergency Communications Center, and so they provide all the 911 services for police, fire, and EMS, about 1 million calls per year. So they're a busy and big place. But thanks to some of the federal level funding that the county has leveraged, they've committed dollars to actually embedding social workers potentially within the 911 center, kind of on the front end. So when you think of it right now, you call 911 and there's really kind of one bucket of resources, police, fire, and EMS. And how can we expand those buckets and decide, are there other more appropriate responses, whether they be mental health responders, social workers, community responders, or other institutions that can be involved in that response, so that we're not burdening, local law enforcement with all these types of calls for which they might not be the appropriate responder or necessarily trained as the best responder for the incident.
Brian, you had your hand up, and then I'm going to ask Jeremy a question.
Yeah, really quickly, my partners really eloquently described, some of the great things they're doing. Just to break it down, if I would also put substance use disorder along with that mental illness, as they're obviously always co-occurring, but the issue is bed space and the issue is resources. And so if you break it down to 2 a.m, a 24-year-old officer that's coming across an individual who's committed a minor crime and they are left with a 72-hour hold, mental health and welfare hold, or jail, neither one of those are really the resources that we need. And so we are stuck with how do we get access to those individuals? And that is where things are falling through the cracks, because even with the mental health worker that Chief Bag has, that individual isn't working 24/7, 7 days a week. And so there is a time where we have someone in crisis that says, I need help. And having someone from my family that, we have a ton of resources and are able to access the best and brightest. Sometimes it takes a week even for us to get our family members into the treatment that they need. So what are our officers going to do when there are no beds for substance use disorder? There are no beds and doctors available to get someone the help they need when they need it.
So, Jeremy, we talked a little bit about community, and one of the dialogues I'm going to have later with community. And I've lived in North St. Paul, grew up in South St. Paul, right down the street from the police department. And I live in an area in Selby and Frogtown where there's more activity that's negative sometimes that's happening. We've had the carjackings and which have escalated in with violence. Tell me a little bit about some of the things that maybe Congress could either help with, or the community can help with, or the state. What can we do with some of the community groups that I know really are out there? Some of them very effective, some of them trying to be more effective. What kind of training do they need? Interaction? Because, and I'm not going to, I'm going to just go ahead and mention the God Squad's out there quite a bit. And I know quite a few of them. And I know you have a good relationship and liaison work with them at times when we needed it. So how do these community groups, what do we need to do to nurture and sustain them so we have those partnerships? Either recognize a red flag, somebody who needs an early intervention, or maybe even somebody who knows somebody's in mental health crisis, because I know, unfortunately, you all too often have to even respond to suicides.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, we understand and we share the community's concern. Reducing violent crime and interrupting the cycle of violence is really our top priority right now. Our police officers are out there responding to shootings every single day in St. Paul. It's taking a toll on the officers. It's taking a toll on our neighborhoods, and our city's overall sense of safety. Our officers are usually the first ones on scene. They hear the screams, they apply the tourniquets, and they're giving comfort to both the victims and their loved ones. We're there with these victims from the first response all the way through the investigation and even through the court cases. And we share their frustration and their sadness. And that's why we're really starting to focus on interrupting this cycle. And I'm really glad you mentioned the community partners. I was fortunate last night to be a part of a community meeting that was hosted by the NAACP. The God Squad was there, a whole host of the community partners that you just are describing. And we talked about that the police department can't solve this violent crime problem alone. It really is going to come down to every single partner, every single community member asking themselves, what can I do to help solve this problem? And so there were some really good discussions and honest conversations last night about we're going to stop pointing fingers at each other and blaming this group or that group or the police or whoever for the problem, and really getting down to let's focus on strategies that are working. We talked a lot about the youth and young adults in our community, and trying to give them resources, give them opportunities, and treat them like human beings, and help them be successful. And I think what I heard last night from those multiple organizations was about funding, having opportunities. We talked about some of the challenges with the local or the state government and not being able to fund some of those programs to the level that would be effective. So that is definitely something that would be helpful, is if we can kind of open up that those opportunities for funding those organizations. And like I said, from all of us on this call, we all realize that collaboration and partnerships is what's going to help make our community safer. And I think, there's not one specific idea or one specific thing that's going to solve the problem. It really is everybody sitting down and working together. And that's why, in St. Paul, Mayor Carter has been extremely supportive with the Community First Public Safety, launching the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And we've been working very closely with them on partnering and really trying to examine what laser focused ideas and solutions that we can come to help reduce the violence in our community.
So I'm going to talk about children just for a second, because this can happen anywhere. I grew up with a grandfather in Montana, huge hunter. And when we were coming up to see him, the guns got stored, they got put up, they got chained, we knew he had them when we'd go out driving in some of the grasslands. He did have a rifle with him, just in case, he had an antelope or, to put something down, but, and he went over everything about what to touch, what not to touch. A gun's never not loaded, a lot of gun safety. And my son was exposed to guns in through scouting and through some of the hunting programs that the DNR does, even though he doesn't hunt or own a gun now. But a lot of families take the time to make sure that their children understand what this weapon's capable of. Other people are purchasing handguns or things like that for their own personal safety, and sometimes not getting trained in the responsibility of how to handle and how to treat this weapon. And so we find unfortunate instances, kids discovering the guns, sometimes taking them to school, sometimes taking them out to play and hiding it because they don't want their parents to know that they're playing with it, right? And then we have a tragedy happen. And then I had a student when I was teaching at North St. Paul High School who committed suicide. And I know that there was a lot of talk about what if there had been a trigger lock, would have slowed him down. The family blamed themselves. It was tough to watch. You're the first on call for those kinds of scenes. If you could go back and do a rerun and do a loop, what are some of the things that we as a community or families or members, and I know some of you have trigger locks available, just you don't even have to ask for one. They're just kind of sitting out there. I saw that when I was in Newport back a couple of years ago. What are some of the things that as I talk to parents or even training that we need to do with community members for gun safety? So we won't talk about banning anything or some of the other legislation that I just talked about, but gun safety and gun storage, because we're really missing the mark on this a lot with first-time gun buyers who are getting no training and aren't realizing that they think that they put it in a safe spot. Kids find everything. They find they find the Christmas present, right? They find things in the house and they aren't going to tell you when they find them. So could you just maybe take a moment if you were talking to a group of folks about how to make, if you have a gun at home, to make it more safe? Erica, you put your hand up right away.
Yeah, actually later today, the Roseville Police Department is going to be announcing it's not a buyback, but a gun turn-in day. And what we find a lot in our community is people inherit guns. They've got guns in their homes that maybe they don't want or are worried about getting into the wrong hands. And so we're just going to have a day where people can come in. They can actually do it any day, but we're going to do a designated day where people can come in and turn in any guns that they just don't feel safe having in their home. And then we'll be destroying those. So and we also obviously have the gun locks available at any time. But we just want people, if they've inherited them, they've got them sitting around, they no longer want them, it's a place to have that gun destroyed.
And that happens a lot in municipalities. People come in and that with guns. I did that when my grandfather passed away to Montana. Every Elks raffle ticket that he won that had a rifle or a shotgun, he won it. He had given them a lot of them away to young hunters, but I was a little taken back when I opened up the chest when I found the locks and everything was chained. how much was in there. Lots of times people, when they are cleaning something out from a family member, find a lot of things. And there's no questions asked when you come into the police department to turn those in. And you can return in ammo too, can you not?
Correct. Yep. And you can do that any day. We're just going to have a designated day where we'll have it out in the parking lot and people can literally just drive through, and we're going to make it as convenient as possible.
So, yes, Tom.
Congresswoman, I just wanted to say real quick, because this dovetails nicely. 2 days ago, we had a meeting with the governor's office with the Department of Public Safety here in the state about what can we do locally. Not getting into specifics where on either side of the aisle, either locally or federally, we're going to run into things. Here's something I'm very passionate about, and we discussed. We need to do, let's just talk about Minnesota. Let's get out there and do an advertising campaign right now. Here's what we know for sure, right? To your point, firearms, safe storage of firearms, we should be doing a campaign. We talk about it all the time. Let's get some billboards. Let's do some things on TV. And it also gives some strategic value as well to people that understand that the majority of guns, and I think Chief Ellison and the other chiefs will agree with this, the majority of guns that I know in my time at the state that have been stolen and used in criminal activities have been stolen from somebody's house that the gun was not secured in, or somebody's car. I mean, we should be doing a campaign about this. Number two, we've seen just some horrific incidents over the last just year of little children being killed, to your point, Congresswoman, by guns that were just laying around in an apartment. They were not secured. Sometimes the person that had that firearm wasn't illegal in the first place, but safe storage of firearms, both in your house and unless you have a gun lock in your car, you shouldn't have it in your car. I mean, those are things that we can do right now, and they don't cost much. And there's support on both sides of the aisle for that. I just think that if we want to educate the public, we need to do it right now more than ever before. And I'm going to leave with a real incident that just happened. I can't say much because it's an active investigation, but an individual has killed a judge over in Wisconsin. But the individual that has been taken into custody had a list of people throughout the country. And on that list was also some people from Minnesota. That gets back to the mental health piece and the red flag laws. And I can't get into anything else about that. You'll all hear about that in the media later today. That's why I was looking down. But advertising now to protect our children, safe storage of firearms, so that they're not using commissions of felonies for all the chiefs that their people are out there arresting those felons. I mean, those are real stats, and we can do that right now.
Well, we experience in our office, it'll come as no surprise to people, threats, and St. Paul PD has our back all the time. And when I've done town halls, a lot of your cities have been involved in making sure that the town halls are conducted safely. That every time one of these shootings happen, and as more and more of them happen with these mass shootings, and people sometimes know that I could be a target. I'm having more people tell me that they really don't want to, come to meetings because they're afraid people are going to bring guns to them. And so we've been doing more Zooms and more outreach like that. And I know the churches now and synagogues, and even some of the, we've seen some thefts now in some of the Islamic centers. People in places of worship are starting not to feel as safe as they should be. So this issue really needs to be addressed. And I like what all of you have said. This is a whole of government. It's a whole of community approach. But I think it can, I'm ready, willing, and able to work on the things that are just kind of common sense, that don't have a partisan label to them. Yes, I want to go farther than some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do with assault weapons bans, but that shouldn't prevent us from doing the things that we all agree on, the things that make the most common sense to do. And I know that that'll make your job safer, it'll make our community safer, and we'll be able to focus on other things rather than responding to mass shooting. In just because this takes a toll, and a couple of you mentioned it, on officers. Are we doing enough to give your officers and Sheriff Fletcher is on, but we have Washington County well represented here. Are there things that we need to do for mental health, both as a community member, as a person who lives in Minnesota, as a federal legislator, to make sure that you're getting the resiliency training to get up and do your job every morning? What more can the community do to support you in your first responder role? And as I said, everything from a tragedy with a suicide or an accidental gun being discharged to dealing with the carnage of some of these mass shootings. What can we do to help you so you can be more effective and steady in your jobs in working with the community? And that's the last question.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think part of it, Congresswoman, is just recognizing what you just said, that everything we're talking about here has its toll and effect on those first responders that are out doing the job. And while we choose to do this job, and while, the fact of the matter is we need men and women that will continue to choose to do this job in the future. And so we remain very proud of the work that our officers do. And we want to make sure that this is a sustainable thing down the road, that we continue to have young people that want to get into this line of work. So we're all trying to be really creative, and we're all trying to recruit and steal from each other on occasion. There's all these good officers, but we all got to be in this together. So community support goes a long ways, and it can be very small gestures, but I think each chief here could tell stories of officers who have been out in the public, who've had positive interactions with community members who've gone out of their way to say thank you, or to just whatever little interaction it is. Those mean so much to our men and women that are out on the front lines. So those little gestures of support are a big deal. I know that's not a big picture thing, but it does kind of help sustain us get through some difficult times, and it's very meaningful to our officers.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you from the 4th District law enforcement leaders who joined us here today. I know how busy your days are. It was a good discussion. My staff's been here. We've been taking notes. I also want to thank those who weren't able to join us today. We know how busy everybody is, and we appreciate their cooperation when we have questions about law enforcement and how to make our communities safer when we're putting together, especially the funding bills that I'll be working on in the next coming weeks. But I also want to thank the staff that work behind you, the person at the reception desk, the person who's taking the phone call, all the people that are behind the scenes, that are behind the uniforms, and especially your families, because you bring your work home with you even when you don't mean to. I'm sure at times you're tired, or it's just been a tough day. So I know it's a team effort for your family. I want you to know that I'll continue to remain steadfast in my commitment to work with you to not only reduce gun violence, but to keep children and families safe from harm, but to give you what you need to do in your piece of solving this problem of how we reduce gun violence. So during the next coming weeks, as I said, Congress will be acting. We'll be voting in the House. We'll be sending bills to the Senate. I hope that the Senate will join us and the American people in demanding action and taking meaningful steps. I'm also going to continue, as I always do, to listen to the public. We'll be meeting with local elected officials, as I said, about some initiatives to improve gun safety. And we're going to be talking to gun safety advocates, many who you work with from the community, about how we can work to prevent this preventable crisis. So for members of the public, those of you who are viewing this discussion today and want to share comments with me, we're going to have a screen that'll go up, and you can go to our website at www.mccollum.house.gov, or if you put in a McCollum Congresswoman or something like that, look for the official site will come up. And then we have some side links on there with some of the things that are going on in our community, some of the bills that are coming up in legislation, and information about our ongoing conversation as we can. Once again, I want to thank all of you for participating today. We had everybody from federal, state to local. We look forward to talking to community leaders in the coming weeks, as well as our other elected officials. But don't forget, for those of you watching, I also want to hear your thoughts. So I wish you all the very best. Have a safe, sunny, no more rain weekend. And thank you so much for participating, and for those who watched and joined us today. Thank you very much. And with that, we will end this session. Thank you.